Welcome, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, our friends and allies, and those who are merely curious. You are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural preached from the pulpit.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the title for today's sermon is, Why Are Humans Special? Okay, now imagine, you're a fireman. There's a building, it's burning. You're rushing in to this burning building. You save the life of a small child. You're stopped by a reporter, and afterwards the reporter asks you, hey, did you have a good time? Did you enjoy yourself? Was that a good experience for you? And you say, wait, what are you talking about? No way. It's not that I ran into the burning building to enjoy myself, to get some sort of pleasure out of the experience. It was the right thing to do. And then the reporter pauses and he says, okay, wait a minute. So that child you saved, it's your child, right? It must be related to you. It must be a cousin, or maybe some sort of maybe your nephew. They say no relationship at all. I'm a fireman. That's what I do. I go in, I save people from burning buildings. I felt it was the right thing to do. And then finally the guy says, the reporter asks you, well, you're planning on getting something back for this at some point, right? I mean, I know this is insurance, right? So when you're old and when you're in a house and it starts to burn down, you're hoping that that kid will grow up and come save you out of a burning building. It's good planning. And again, you say, no, seriously. I just did it because I felt like it was the right thing to do. All right, so Darwin writes, under circumstances of extreme peril, as during a fire, when a man endeavors to save a fellow creature without a moment's hesitation, he can hardly feel pleasure, and still less has he time to reflect on the dissatisfaction he might subsequently experience if he did not make the attempt. Should he afterwards reflect over his own conduct, he would feel that there lies within him an impulsive power wildly different from a search after pleasure or happiness, and this seems to be the deeply planted social instinct. So for Darwin, his explanation for why people risk their lives and go running into burning buildings is they want to do it because it's the right thing to do. They have a moral sentiment. It comes out of social instincts. And we saw that when on an earlier sermon when I talked about the Carnegie heroes. I don't know how many of you remember that. But when people were interviewed afterwards, the reason that they didn't say it's because we did a quick calculation, we wanted to improve utility, we thought it would be a really fun thing to save a person from a charging bull. They couldn't really express why they did it, other than the fact that they felt it was the right thing to do in that situation. And that's what caused them to do the heroic act or whatever they did that we would consider the right act. So I think it's odd that I'm forced to justify, there's something weird about our culture right now, where to say that someone's acting heroically just for the sake of acting heroically seems like such a bizarre statement. But there is something, maybe, I don't know, I'll blame the utilitarians who want to explain everything in terms of happiness, or I'll blame, I don't know, Dawkins, though I don't think it's completely fair to, that wants to explain everything in terms of selfish genes. But to actually say that people do things because they feel like it's the right thing to do, I think, that's what Darwin's saying. I think it's the intuitive, sort of natural understanding of things before you've been, corrupted by too much philosophy or too much science. That's where people would go to. So the idea, the basic idea is that humans are really motivated to be moral because they have certain moral sentiments. And that whole idea is, again, we're kind of cynical about that. In fact, our whole idea of rationality right now is based around the idea that people only do things out of selfish material good. But the whole point of moral sentiments is, no, people are not motivated just from sort of material benefit. They're also motivated because they find value in helping the community. So this is what I want to talk about in today's sermon. What I want to talk about is, I'm going to talk about two books that, that I'm going to grab a bunch of research from and present to you today. And really the overall thesis is that human beings, what makes us special, to get back to the title of the talk, what makes us unique is unique among animals, we have these moral sentiments, and it's these moral sentiments that allow us to act morally in society. So the two books are, first, the book A Natural History of Human Thinking, and that's by Michael Tomasello. And he's a research at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and so he works directly with chimpanzees, and he also has a philosophical background as well. I'm drawing on his material. I'm also going to take advantage of some work by two economists. They wrote a book, Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis wrote a book called A Cooperative Species. Both excellent books, strongly recommend both of them. But the overall thesis, just to repeat of the sermon today, are humans are special. And by special, again, I don't mean that, humans they've had some divine spark given to them, which made them special and unique in all of creation. I'm saying that they're special in their particular evolutionary path, and that specialness resulted in humans, unlike other animals, developing social emotions and having moral emotions that we don't share with the rest of animals on Earth. So again, not a difference in kind, just a difference in degree with the rest of life that surrounds us. Okay, so let's go back to the basis for all of this. How do you actually explain how people can act in a moral way, in an altruistic way? How can you find justification for that? And the idea here is, like in a lot of things, Darwin just got it right originally. Darwin believed in something that became very, very unpopular, especially when I was in graduate school. This is the whole idea of group selectionism was strongly frowned upon. But it's very clear that if you read Darwin's Descent of Man, Darwin's a big believer in the idea that selection can not only work at the level of an individual, it can also work at the level of an entire tribe. For example, he writes, when two tribes of primeval man living in the same country came into competition, circumstances being equal, the one tribe included a great number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful members who are always ready to warn each other of danger, to aid and defend each other. This tribe would succeed better and conquer the other. So Darwin was very clear. He believed that selection not only could work at the level of an individual, it could work at the level of a whole tribe, and that you had group selection going on when you had to compare two tribes against another. So, and he believed, quite clearly that morality grew out of the social emotions that came from surviving tribes. He believed that some of it was, Darwin still believed in a little bit of use inheritance, so he thought that might be in play, but he believed it could be mostly explained through the theory of natural selection. He writes, the feeling of pleasure from society is probably an extension of the parental or filial affections. Since the social instinct seems to be developed by the young, instinct seems to be developed by the young remaining for a long time with their parents, and this extension may be attributed in part to habit, but chiefly to natural selection. So his theory was, started off, the reason that humans cooperated together was probably because of familial sentiments. So the love of a mother for the mother's child, or a child for their parents. That was the basis of the social instincts, but that grew out over time to cover the tribe, and people were willing to sacrifice themselves not only for their particular family, but also for their entire tribe. Okay, so some definitions before we get into the experiments. So, unfortunately, the word altruism has been corrupted by the way it's been used over the last 30 years, so I just want to be very careful about the terminology I use here when I'm talking about altruism. So there's been three general theories of how people can be altruistic. And three general theories coming from both game theory and also coming from the theory of natural selection. And I'm just going to give those names and distinguish what exactly we're focusing on today against all the possibilities. So first, there's the idea of kin selection, right? And the idea of kin selection, that's the J.B.S. Haldane quote, I would gladly sacrifice my life to save 8 of my cousins, right? Has to be 8, no less than 8, and that's just a matter of math. If all of natural selection is about differential success, reproductive success, then, you know, if you have 8 cousins and you can sacrifice yourself, you get those genes down to the next generation one way or another. So that can be explained very clearly from the point of view of the theory of natural selection. Kin selection makes sense, but I just want to clarify here that it's hard to argue that that's actually altruism, right? I mean, you are finding a proxy for yourself, in the sense of fitness, you're finding a proxy for yourself to pass down your genes. So you're not actually giving anything up, you're just calculating another way that you can get your fitness passed down through, you know, relatives, basically. So that's kin selection. That's one way that altruism could develop. Another type of altruism that there's been a lot of attention on is this whole idea of reciprocal altruism. And the authors of the book that I'm talking about are Russian and say, well, this shouldn't really be called reciprocal altruism at all. It should really be called enlightened self-interest. But the idea of reciprocal altruism, you know, comes down to the one phrase, you know, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. I mean, it comes down to the idea that if you have a group of people who are cooperating over time, then it makes sense for people to maximize everyone's benefit, that they will, you know, that they'll be willing to give things up in the short term to be able to get things back in the long term. And actually, as a whole group, everyone might benefit more. So it's actually, you'll get paid back. You'll get paid back by being able to show cooperation with your fellow man. And then finally, there's this third notion, and this is really the notion that I'm going to be focusing on today, of multi-level selection. And that's what used to be called group selectionism. But the idea there is that the unit of selection doesn't have to be a single individual, it can also be a tribe, right? That selection can work against a tribe. And the difference between multi-level selection and the other two types of altruism is in multi-level selection, that's really the only one that has true altruism in it, because it's really the only case in which someone's sacrificing their fitness, their ability to pass their genes down to the next generation for the benefit of the overall tribe. So they're really giving something up. There's sacrifice involved when you have this pure form of altruism, which you don't have with kin selection or with reciprocal altruism. So one way to be careful about the definition here, and this is how Bowles makes the distinction, is between the idea of mutualism and altruism. So the idea of mutualism is people working together toward a common goal and everyone benefiting out of it, but no one actually has potential for a loss in that case. But when you get to true altruism, this is, strictly speaking, a situation where it will result in less reproductive success for me, but greater for the group. So that's the type of altruism that I'm going to focus on, the multi-level selectionism. Okay, so to the research. First, as far as we know, humans are the only animals that have the moral emotions that I'm going to be talking about. They're the only ones. You know, Darwin points out in the expressions of emotions of man and animals that humans are the only animals that we know of that blush, right? That show certain social emotions, things like shame, pride, guilt. Those are things that seem to be human specific. And I'll talk about the reasons why these guys think that that's true later on. It is true, so let me talk a little bit about Tomasello, and he's the one who wrote the book on the history of human thinking. And what his basic thesis is in the book is that what distinguishes apes from humans, the reason, for example, humans have language, that humans can build institutions, cultural institutions, is that the distinctive thing about humans is we're able to build up collective intentionality. And so it's really this idea of joint goals. And let me explain that, because I think it's the foundation of most of the other stuff that I'm going to be talking about. But the idea there is that he spent a lot of time studying chimps, right? Chimpanzees. And chimps, I hope this doesn't ruin your idea of chimps, but chimps actually spend, time hunting down monkeys, right? They eat monkeys for food. They'll get together in groups and they'll hunt monkeys together. So when chimpanzees do that, though, you might think that they're cooperating to be able to hunt down monkeys. But what Tomasello argues is that they're not. They're not actually cooperating at all. It's a form of mutualism, that they're all, they all get a benefit out of capturing the monkey, because that's dinner for tonight. They happen to be working in parallel to be able to carry this out, but this isn't true cooperation. And that's very different from even very young human children. By the age of 3, humans, for example, are able to start forming joint goals together making it a goal and setting it as, sort of a group project that they're working together. So he gives an example of this experiment where they took pairs of 3-year-old children, and they had to do this task where they had to bring something up to the top of a set of steps. And the children had to both do it, and then they got some sort of reward for doing it. And the children very quickly understood the idea, oh, this is a joint task, we have to do it together, we have to get it done together. And then this is what they threw in. What the experimenters did is, so halfway through the task, they stopped one of the kids, and they gave that kid the reward early. So that kid no longer had a reason to keep going up the stairs. It's like, okay, here's your reward. And what they discovered is that the kid would continue to go up the steps because it was a joint task, and he wanted to make sure that they got the shared goal done together. If you look at chimpanzees, where they did the same experiment, chimpanzee didn't care. He got his reward. He was out of there. He got his snack. There's no reason to keep continuing in the joint goal. It's not something that they're setting together as a project, so you don't have any of this collective intentionality. And in general, he talks about, there's a lot of research that shows that, children understand that they're violating some sort of norm when they, for example, you ask a child to leave one game to go join a more fun game. Children will, from a very young age, learn how to apologize to the other kids, and they understand that they're actually, moving away from a joint activity over to a different joint activity. Again, chimpanzees just seem to be completely unconscious of any sort of group coordination. They're just not capable of doing it. All right, so now I want to switch over to some of the research, not from Tomasello, but from Bowles. And what Bowles is, just to give you his background is in economics. And so most of his evidence has to do with game theory. He also he's also done some cultural anthropology to pull in some evidence as well, but it's really coming up with models to explain human behaviors. And the main, just to sort of, give away the whole point of all his research, the main point of his research is to show that when humans interact, they don't interact in a selfish manner. That humans, by and large, the natural way that humans interact is through sharing, and that they have a built-in cooperative instinct, and they seem to be driven more by moral sentiments. Even when they understand the rules of the game, people tend to do the good thing. Not always, which we'll get to in a bit, but they tend to cooperate and do the right thing. So let's talk about the different experiments that he did. We've already talked here about the ultimatum game. Do you guys all remember how that worked, the ultimatum game? I love that game. So the idea with the game is you give one person $10, right? And what they can do is they can take any amount of that $10 and give it to someone else. And then the other person can, after they get the money, they can say whether they want to reject or accept that exchange. If they reject it, neither one of them get any money at all. If they accept it, they both end up with the money that they have. Now, if you were to analyze the ultimatum game, let's say that you can only transfer whole dollars, right? No cents. What's the rational strategy there for the person who starts with the $10? What should he do? What's the right thing? Yes, John?
Well, it's probably smart. They do it half and half.
Oh, you want to do it half and half?
Yeah, but again, I think maybe it would be a good idea to do 4 or something, because then the other person, oh my god, well, I still get $4.
You're going to cheat the other person a little bit. I know, I'm on to you. I know what you're trying to do there. All right, well, good. It makes me feel good, John, that you said that. But but what you should do if you're doing this from the very strict definition of rational, where you're trying to maximize your own material gain, in that definition of rational, the right thing to do is $1, right? It would be irrational if you gave $1 to someone else for them to reject that offer, because $1 is better than nothing, right? And so they should accept any offer that you give them, because that would be the rational thing to do. But as John just pointed out, the majority of people don't do that. They follow a strategy like John's strategy. They end up giving half the money. Actually, let me give you the exact numbers for it. So, however, when actually played, the predicted outcome is almost never observed and rarely even approximated. In many replications of this experiment, in more than 30 countries, under different conditions, and in some cases with substantial amounts of money at stake, proposers routinely offer responders very generous shares, typically 50%, is the model offer. Responders frequently reject offers under 25%. And of course, the interesting thing too here is when they interview the responders who reject the offer later, they're usually quite angry. They said, this guy was trying to cheat me. You know, they gave me $1. I was very angry. Of course I rejected it. And, you know, which again, strictly speaking, is irrational behavior if you understand humans as just trying to maximize their own material gain. I mean, you should take the $1, right? $1 is better than nothing. That would have been the right thing to do. So let's move on. Another experiment. Everyone's familiar with the prisoner's dilemma. This is probably the most heavily investigated experiment where they've experimentally tried to reproduce it over and over again. Just to summarize the idea behind this prisoner's dilemma. So you have two prisoners, Alice and Bob, and they can't communicate. And both of these guys can either cooperate or defect, right? And they get different payoffs depending on whether they cooperate or defect. If both of them cooperate, then they each get $10. Not bad. If one defects, then the defector gets $5, but the other person gets 0, right? So if you defect, you get the $5, but the other person gets nothing. And then finally, if one cooperates and the other defects, then the defector gets $15. That's the biggest payoff at all. If you defect on someone else, then you get the $15. So that's pretty cool. All right, so you can make it's a really easy argument to show that the rational thing to do in any situation is to always defect. And you can do this a disjunctive argument. What you do is you say, okay, I need to make a decision. I'm Bob, I'm working with Alice. Alice can only do one of two things, right? Alice is either going to defect or cooperate. And if Alice defects, then the right thing for me to do is I better defect too, or I'm going to end up with 0, right? And so if we both defect, well, at least we'll both get, what is it? We both defect, then we each get what? Yeah, if one defects, then the defector gets $5. So if we both defect, then we both get the $10, right? Is that right? Oh, well. Anyway, so I'll work it out later. But so what you want to do if the other person defects is you want to defect. If the other person chooses to cooperate, well, that's when you can really maximize. Then you defect as well. And so in either scenario, the proper thing for you to do is defect if you want to maximize the amount of money that you're making in the prisoner's dilemma. All right, so that's troubling to people, right? Because people want to say, hey, they should cooperate. But just from purely analysis of what the rational thing to do in that situation, you should always defect. Okay, but again, people don't do that. They often cooperate. And there's actually a nice real-world example of the prisoner's dilemma. I never watched this TV show. Apparently, Mark Wahlberg hosted it for a little bit, but it was called Friend or Foe. Did anyone watch Friend or Foe? I don't know. Apparently, it was American television popular. But anyway, they did the prisoner's dilemma, and this was for real money. This was, you could win somewhere between $200 and $22,000. But about half the contestants decide to cooperate, even though they were guaranteed to earn more money if they defected. So anyway, so people again just have a natural tendency to cooperate even when it's against their own best interest. Another game, the trust game. I like this game. In the trust game, the idea is Alice is given $10. And Alice can take that $10 and give it to Bob. But when Bob gets it, it gets doubled, right? So if Alice starts out with $10, it gets doubled when it's given over to Bob, so he has $20. And then Bob can decide how much money to give back to Alice. So the different scenarios here is if Alice trusts Bob completely, then she'll give all of her money. She'll transfer it all over to Bob, and then we'll get doubled, and then Bob could actually transfer half of it back, and they'll both end up with $10, right? So, Alice doesn't actually gain anything, but she doesn't lose anything either, and Bob gains the same amount that Alice started with. If Alice doesn't trust Bob, then she'll transfer no money at all, right? That makes sense. And then finally, this is the Bob being immoral situation. Alice could transfer all of her money to Bob, and then Bob can just hold it all, right? He gets $20 in that situation. He wouldn't have to give any of it back at all to Alice. So again, the results are the rational thing to do is for Alice not to trust Bob at all, keep all the money for herself, because it's completely crazy to expect the other person to give the money back. But people don't do that. They've done this experiment again and again across different countries, and people usually start off by transferring about half of their money over, expecting to get the money back, and they do get the money back. So final experiment, it's called the public goods game. And in this game, here's how this one works. So the public goods game, each person gets $1 in their account, in their private account, and they have a choice each round of how much of that private dollar they want to transfer into the public account. And the idea there is anything they transfer into the public account, they take the whole pot of money from everyone, like all 10 people playing the game, and they take half of that and add it back into the public account. So if you really want to maximize the total pot for everyone, everyone should always be transferring their private $1 into the public account, and then it'll keep growing. But you have the choice not to. You just transfer, a fraction of it in if you didn't trust the other people around you. What happens in that case is, so in repeated plays, subjects always begin by contributing about half their money. And then what happens is over time, depending on the reactions of the other people in the group, they either, they cooperate less and less. And let me explain something about that. There's a couple things. First, one thing that Bowles and Gintis point out about the public goods game, some people have argued that the reason that people cooperate in situations like this is that they're just confused about the rules of the game, right? They're not following they can't do the calculations correctly on the prisoner's dilemma. They want to act rationally, it's just they're not smart enough to figure it out, and they're making bad decisions. So one of the interesting conclusions from the public goods games is that they repeated this experiment over and over again with the same group of people. And what they discovered is at the beginning of each round, people would start cooperating again. And it wasn't until their trust was violated that they'd start reducing their cooperation level. So it doesn't seem to just be a matter of, they don't really understand the rules, because otherwise you would expect them to be burnt once and then say, hey, I'm not playing with you guys anymore. Or if I'm going to play again, I'm just going to keep all the money in my private account. What happens is, it's a new day, and we try to cooperate with people again until people get burnt. So the overall goal of this research is to show that humans are not motivated solely. They are motivated somewhat, but not solely by material gain. That people naturally want to do the right thing. And he has some other research that shows that as well. I think one of his most interesting examples is this example of when people are given a choice whether or not to do things because they're being asked to do it because it's the right thing versus getting some sort of financial incentive to do it. And some examples of that research is when you ask people to donate blood, what they discovered is that if you offered to pay women for donating the blood, they discovered that they could actually decrease the number willing to donate by almost half. So actually giving money is a disincentive for people for doing it, because before they were doing it because of public virtue, right? I want to donate blood because it's good for the community. What, you're paying me for it? Well, now it must be worth something. So, why am I doing it? Another example of that is they have an example where they have a daycare center in Israel. And what happened was the parents were late picking up their kids from the daycare. You've heard of this one. They're late picking up the kids at the daycare. And so originally their reaction to that was, well, I know, we'll fine them for being late. But what happened was that actually had the opposite effect of trying to get parents to show up earlier, because now they said, oh, that's how much it costs to be late? Okay, I can live with that. And they're willing to pay out that amount of money to be able to show up a little late. When before they were motivated because they don't want to, inconvenience the daycare workers. So their motivations changed. And I have from my own private experience, another example of that. How many of you know what Stack Overflow is? How many of you have used Stack? Okay, great. All programmers have used it. Fantastic. So Stack Overflow, it's a question and answer website. So programmers come along, they post questions, and then they get answers to the questions on the website. And I once saw Joe Spolsky, who was one of the people who created it. He once gave a talk, and I went to his talk, and he said something very interesting. He was saying, well, originally when they were designing Stack Overflow, the real challenge there was, well, how do you get, programmers, professional programmers to come in and answer questions? And originally their idea was, well, we'll pay them. We'll give them a certain percentage of the money that we're taking in from advertising, and that way we can encourage people to come in and answer questions. But it turns out that, a lot of these guys who are answering questions are like people making, a $400,000 salary. And the amount of time for them to answer a question, for them to pay that out, it's just, an insane amount of money. And so, and they were, mildly insulted when you offered them, what they could really afford to pay them to answer the questions. But so they just did away with any sort of payment out to the answerers. And now they have developers who really should be spending time doing more useful stuff, but who are off on Stack Overflow spending hours crafting, answers where they're not doing it from any sort of, any sort of direct financial gain at all. They're doing it to build their reputation and for other reasons, other motivations other than material gain. Okay. But I don't want to suggest by all this research, and also, these guys won't suggest it either, that humans are naturally angels. That just set free, humans would always do the right thing, that we would all cooperate and be good people, and, because it doesn't work that way. So if you have in these cooperation games, like the public trust game, you have to have a way to prevent freeloaders on the system, that there will be a certain percentage of people who defect all the time. And so what happens over time on like the public trust game is that's why people start with cooperating, and for most of the rounds they actually very, very quickly end up not cooperating because the freeloaders learn that they could start maximizing their benefit with the cost of the other people in the group. So they, as they write, in a social dilemma that is repeated for a number of periods, subjects tend to start with a positive and significant level of cooperation, but unless there are very few free riders in the group, cooperation subsequently decays to a very low level. So there's a couple ways that you can prevent that. One way to prevent that is by allowing the participants to choose their own groups. So if they can self-select, I only want to work with other cooperators, then they can keep 85 to 90% success rate as long as they're able to get rid of the freeloaders, exclude them. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is through some sort of shaming mechanism. It comes down to, they found that if all they did, there's something called cheap talk when they do these experiments. Cheap talk is when they allow the people who are participating in the experiment to talk to one another and to make promises and all that, but there's no way to enforce it, right? They have to follow the rules of the game. And that's why it's called cheap talk, because there's no enforcement possibility. And they found that if they even had them chat by computer while they're doing the cooperation game, that it dramatically increased the level of cooperation. And even as much as, or as close to as much as if they were in face-to-face communication. So just being, the shaming experience is enough to keep people on the sort of moral path of cooperation when these experiments were going on. All right, so I want to move on to talk about why they think humans behave this way. Why are we so irrational? Why do we do these stupid things like, give up benefits for us for our larger tribe? And so there's a lot of, these are long quotes, I'm summarizing here. So the basic idea is, for them, it all comes down to their theory that humans uniquely had a lot of war in our early experience. And so they try to gather together evidence to show that there is a lot of fighting between early human tribes. And so the basic idea is that, typical size of a tribe is about 77 people, and there was a strange period of time when human growth was extremely slow, unnaturally slow, and they attribute that to population crashes. There was a lot of infighting between the tribes, and that's the reason why there was a slow growth, and about 20,000 years ago, all of a sudden, a quick spike in human growth. So that's the basic idea. They need this justification for their theory, right? Because their whole theory is selection happening at the level of the tribe. And so to explain the unique feature of human social instincts, you have to say, well, there's something unique about our historical background, our evolutionary background. And the distinct thing they're pointing out is there was a lot of infighting between tribes, and that's why we developed the social emotions that we did. And to provide justification for that, they point out, during times of war, humans do act more altruistically. And they have some experimental evidence for that. But basically, I don't think they need much of that. When people talk about times of courage, leaping onto grenades and things like that, it's typically within times of war. When a country is in a state of fear, that's when people band together and start sharing, and everyone knows the stories around that. So the idea is that the inter-tribe fighting is what actually caused these social emotions to develop. So they write that once these emotions were created, these social emotions were created from our early history, human behaviors systematically deviate from the model of the self-interested actor, and we think the evidence is strong that social emotions account for most of the discrepancy. So there are two emotions that they're focused on, is guilt and shame, and they're distinguishing between guilt and shame because guilt is all about, you know you broke the social norms, you did something wrong. But shame is when other people know it, so that you feel, shamed within your collective group. And the idea here is that this is, for them, shame and guilt are just kind of like shortcuts. They're ways that you get all the people to follow some general rules to be able to maximize the benefit of the overall tribe. So anyway, so that's it. That's all I'm going to go talk about today. But the thing that was interesting to me about this research is, first, the main thesis is that humans are unique because, unlike other animals, we have these social emotions that were developed through the process of natural selection. That social emotions like shame and guilt are really what keep us cooperating together, that you have to have those social norms. And, I found it a little depressing. If the theory is actually that we develop these great social emotions from war, that kind of makes me feel sad because, war is a bad thing. I don't really want to think that that's the cause of, why people do good things in society. Yeah, let me go ahead and leave it at that, and we'll open it up for discussion.